The wind howled through the pines as Sarah Gray felt strong arms lift her from the frozen ground, her swollen belly making her feel impossibly fragile. Through swollen eyes, she glimpsed the bearded face of the mountain man who had found her, his voice cutting through the storm with quiet certainty. "No one will hurt you again." The words settled over her like a warm blanket, and for the first time in months, Sarah believed she might actually survive. 3 months earlier, Sarah had been a different woman entirely. She stood at the window of her small cabin, watching her husband Donald Morales chop wood in the yard below, one hand resting protectively over her growing belly. The baby kicked, and she smiled, pressing her palm against the movement. In just a few more months, their little family would be complete. Donald looked up and caught her watching, his weathered face breaking into the grin that had first captured her heart 5 years ago. The autumn of 1878 had painted the Colorado Territory in brilliant golds and crisp reds, and Sarah felt blessed beyond measure. Their homestead sat in a valley surrounded by towering peaks, isolated but beautiful, exactly what they had dreamed of when they left Missouri. Donald had built their cabin with his own hands, every log carefully chosen and fitted. The barn housed their small herd of cattle and their 2 horses, and Sarah's vegetable garden had yielded enough to see them through the coming winter. She moved away from the window to check the bread rising on the warm hearth. The cabin smelled of yeast and the dried herbs she had harvested and hung from the rafters. Everything felt perfect, settled, as if their life had finally found its proper rhythm. The baby would arrive in late winter, and Sarah had already begun preparing tiny clothes, her fingers working the soft wool by lamplight, while Donald read aloud from their worn copy of Shakespeare. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Donald pulled her close against his side. His hand found her belly, and they both felt the baby's response to his touch. "You are going to be such a good father," Sarah whispered, and Donald kissed the top of her head. The child kicked again, stronger this time, and they both laughed softly. Donald began humming an old song his mother had sung to him, and Sarah felt herself drifting toward sleep, completely content. She woke to silence. The fire had burned low, and Donald's side of the bed was cold. Sarah sat up, listening, but heard nothing except the wind in the trees outside. "Donald," she called softly, thinking he might have gone to check on the animals. When no answer came, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and padded to the window. The yard was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air crept up her spine. Donald never left without telling her, especially not at night. She lit a lamp and checked the cabin, but he was nowhere to be found. His coat still hung by the door, his boots were missing, but his rifle remained in its place above the mantel. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized something was terribly wrong. She pulled on her own boots and coat, taking the lamp outside. "Donald," she called, louder now. Her voice echoed off the surrounding peaks and returned to her unchanged. The barn door stood slightly ajar, unusual for Donald, who was meticulous about securing the animals. Sarah hurried across the yard, her lamp casting dancing shadows on the ground. Inside the barn, she found chaos. The horses were gone, and their few cattle milled nervously in their stalls. Hay was scattered across the floor, and one of the support posts showed deep gouges, as if someone had tied a rope around it and pulled hard. Sarah's lamp trembled in her hands as she took in the scene. This was not the work of wild animals or a simple theft. Someone had taken their horses, and somehow Donald was gone too. Back in the cabin, Sarah tried to think clearly, despite the panic rising in her chest. She should ride to the nearest neighbor, the Henderson place about 10 miles south, but without the horses, she would have to walk. In her condition, heavily pregnant and with winter approaching, such a journey would be dangerous, but staying alone seemed equally perilous. As dawn broke gray and cold, Sarah made her decision. She packed what food she could carry, wrapped herself in Donald's heavy coat, and set out on foot toward the Henderson homestead. Surely Donald had gone after whoever took their horses and would return to find her gone. She left a note explaining where she had gone, weighted down with a stone on the kitchen table. The first few miles passed without incident. Sarah knew the trail well, having traveled it many times with Donald to visit their neighbors. But as the morning wore on, the baby seemed to grow heavier, and her back began to ache fiercely. She stopped frequently to rest, one hand pressed against the small of her back, the other supporting her belly. By midday, clouds had gathered overhead, promising snow. Sarah pushed herself harder, knowing she needed to reach shelter before the weather turned. Her feet were beginning to blister in Donald's oversized boots, but she pressed on. The baby had grown quiet, which worried her almost as much as its previous restlessness had. She was still 3 miles from the Henderson place when the first snowflakes began to fall. Within an hour, what had started as a gentle dusting became a driving storm that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah stumbled off the trail twice, only finding her way back by following the fence line that marked the boundary between properties. The wind picked up as afternoon faded toward evening, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she was not going to make it to the Hendersons before dark. The snow was already ankle-deep and showed no signs of stopping. She looked around desperately for any kind of shelter and spotted what appeared to be an old trapper's lean-to about 50 yards off the trail. The structure was more dilapidated than she had hoped, with gaps in the walls that let in the wind and snow, but it was better than nothing. Sarah huddled inside, pulling Donald's coat tight around her. She had brought some jerky and hardtack, but the cold made eating difficult, and her hands shook as she tried to chew the tough meat. As night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically. Sarah had no way to build a fire, no dry wood or kindling, and the wind seemed to find every gap in her makeshift shelter. She curled into a ball, trying to conserve what warmth she could, but the cold seeped through her clothes and into her bones. The baby kicked weakly, and Sarah whispered apologies, pressing her hands against her belly. She dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to find snow drifting across her legs. By morning, she was stiff with cold and could barely feel her fingers and toes. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by 2 feet of fresh snow. Sarah struggled to her feet, every muscle protesting, and realized that her situation had become desperate. The trail was completely obscured, and without landmarks visible through the uniform white landscape, Sarah had no idea which direction to go. She picked what she thought was the right way and began walking, but within an hour she knew she was lost. The sun, when it occasionally broke through the clouds, seemed to be in the wrong position, and nothing looked familiar. By afternoon, exhaustion forced her to stop. She had been walking in circles, she realized, seeing her own tracks crossing and recrossing in the snow. The baby had not moved for hours, and Sarah felt a new kind of fear creeping into her heart. She sank down against a large boulder, no longer caring about the cold seeping through her clothes. That was when she heard the voices. At first, Sarah thought she might be hallucinating from cold and exhaustion, but the voices grew closer, and she could make out words, though she could not understand the language. She tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. Then she saw them, 3 men on horseback, moving through the trees about 100 yards away. Relief flooded through her, and she managed to stand, waving her arms. "Here," she croaked. "Please help me." The men spotted her and rode closer, and Sarah's relief began to curdle into unease. They were rough-looking men, unshaven and dirty, with hard eyes that looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. The leader, a man with a scraggly beard and missing teeth, dismounted and approached her. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made Sarah want to run. "What do we have here? A pretty little thing all alone in the snow." He reached out and touched her face, and Sarah jerked away. "Please," she said, "I am lost. My husband, he is missing, and I need to get to the Henderson place. Can you help me?" The man laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. The other 2 had also dismounted and were moving to flank her. "Oh, we can help you," the leader said. "We can help you a lot. But first, you are going to help us." Sarah backed against the boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could see in their faces what they intended, and terror gave her strength she did not know she possessed. She tried to run, but in the deep snow and in her condition, she made it only a few steps before the leader caught her arm. Now," he said, his grip painfully tight. "No need to make this difficult. We will take good care of you." His companions laughed, and Sarah felt her world tilting toward nightmare. What followed was the darkest period of Sarah's life. The 3 men who she learned were named Philip Price, Nathan Richardson, and Stephen Adams. had been living rough in the mountains, surviving by theft and worse. They had a camp hidden in a box canyon about 5 miles from where they found Sarah, a place where they felt safe from any pursuit. They kept her there for weeks, and Sarah endured treatment that left her body bruised and her spirit nearly broken. She was given barely enough food to survive, and the shelter they provided was little better than what she had found in the abandoned lean-to. The men took turns guarding her, making sure she could never escape, and they made it clear that any attempt to run would result in consequences she did not want to imagine. The only thing that kept Sarah sane was the baby. Despite everything, the child continued to grow and move, a constant reminder that she had something to live for beyond her own survival. She talked to the baby in whispers when her captors were not listening, promising that somehow she would find a way to keep them both safe. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to notice patterns in her captors' behavior. Philip was the leader and the cruelest, but he was also lazy and often drunk. Nathan was nervous and jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Stephen was the youngest and seemed the least committed to their criminal lifestyle, though he was too frightened of Philip to oppose him directly. Sarah also learned that they had been responsible for more than just her husband's disappearance. They bragged about other homesteads they had raided, other families they had destroyed. Her heart broke as she realized that Donald was almost certainly dead, killed when he tried to protect their property and their life together. The knowledge that she was truly alone in the world, with only her unborn child for company, might have destroyed her completely. Instead, it sparked something fierce and determined deep in her core. She began to plan, watching for any opportunity to escape, no matter how slim the chances might be. Her opportunity came during a blizzard in late November. Philip had been drinking heavily, and Nathan and Stephen had gone hunting, leaving only the drunken leader to watch her. Sarah had been feigning illness for days, convincing Philip that she was too weak to cause trouble. When he passed out beside the fire, Sarah carefully gathered what few supplies she could find and slipped out into the storm. She had no clear plan beyond getting as far away as possible before Philip woke up. The snow was falling so heavily that she could barely see her own feet, but she pressed on, driven by desperation and the fierce need to protect her child. She knew the men would come after her as soon as they discovered her gone, and in the snow they would be able to track her easily. For hours, Sarah struggled through drifts that sometimes reached her waist. Her pregnancy made every step an ordeal, and the cold was so intense that she lost feeling in her extremities within the first hour. But she kept moving, knowing that to stop meant certain death, either from the cold or from her captors. As dawn broke, the storm began to clear, and Sarah found herself on a ridge overlooking a vast valley she did not recognize. Behind her, she could see smoke rising from the canyon where the men had kept her, and she knew they would soon discover her absence. Ahead lay unknown territory, but it represented hope, however slim. She began the treacherous descent into the valley, slipping and sliding on the icy rocks. Halfway down, her foot caught in a crevice, and she fell hard, landing on her side with a cry of pain. For several minutes she lay still, afraid to move, afraid of what the fall might have done to the baby. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself upright. Her ankle throbbed, and she could feel wetness that might have been blood soaking through her torn dress. But the baby moved, a strong kick that brought tears of relief to her eyes. She struggled to her feet and continued down the slope, favoring her injured ankle. By midday, Sarah was barely conscious. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and hunger had pushed her body beyond its limits. She stumbled and fell repeatedly, each time finding it harder to get back up. The baby had grown quiet again, and Sarah whispered constant apologies, promising to find them both safety if she could just keep moving a little longer. She was crossing a frozen stream when her strength finally gave out completely. Her legs simply stopped working, and she collapsed face first into the snow beside the ice. For a moment she lay still, feeling the cold seeping through her clothes, and wondered if this was how it would end. She thought of Donald, of their dreams for their family, of the baby who would never have a chance to live if she gave up now. With tremendous effort, Sarah rolled onto her back and tried to sit up, but her body would not obey her commands anymore. She could move her arms weakly, but her legs felt like dead weight. Panic began to set in as she realized she was paralyzed by cold and exhaustion, unable to move, unable to seek shelter or warmth. The sun was beginning to set, painting the snow around her pink and gold. It would have been beautiful under other circumstances, but now it meant that the killing cold of a mountain night was approaching. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for the end, her hand resting on her belly where the baby lay still and quiet. That was when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps crunching through the snow. Her eyes snapped open and terror flooded through her. Had her captors found her at last? She tried to move, to hide, but her body still would not respond. The footsteps grew closer, and Sarah held her breath, praying that death would come quickly. But the figure that emerged from the trees was not one of the three men who had tormented her. This was someone entirely different, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and kind eyes that widened in shock when they saw her lying in the snow. He was dressed in heavy furs and carried a rifle, clearly someone who belonged in this harsh wilderness. The man approached slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. "Easy there," he said, his voice gentle despite its deep rumble. "I am not going to hurt you. My name is Larry Williams. What are you doing out here alone?" Sarah tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged. The man, Larry, knelt beside her in the snow, his eyes taking in her condition with obvious concern. "You are hurt," he said. "Not a question, but a statement. And pregnant. Lord Almighty, how did you get way out here?" He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, the warmth immediate and overwhelming. Sarah began to cry, not from pain or fear, but from relief so intense it felt like physical pain. For weeks she had known only cruelty and violence from men, and this stranger's simple kindness broke something loose inside her chest. "Can you tell me your name?" Larry asked, checking her pulse at her wrist. Sarah managed to whisper her name, and he nodded. "Sarah, I am going to get you somewhere warm and safe, but first I need to know if you can feel your legs. Can you move your feet for me?" Sarah tried, but nothing happened. Larry's expression grew more serious, but his voice remained calm and reassuring. "That is all right," he said. "The cold can do that sometimes. We will get you warmed up and see how you are doing then. I am going to lift you now, Sarah. I know it might hurt, but I need to get you to shelter." When Larry's arms slid under her, Sarah tensed instinctively, memories of rough hands and cruel intentions flooding back. But his touch was careful, respectful, and when he lifted her, he did so with a gentleness she had not experienced in months. She felt impossibly light in his arms, despite her pregnancy, and she realized how much weight she had lost during her captivity. Larry carried her through the forest with steady, sure steps, apparently knowing exactly where he was going. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of movement and the sound of his breathing. Once she opened her eyes to find him looking down at her with an expression of such concern that she felt tears starting again. "You are going to be all right," he said when he noticed she was awake. "I have got you now. No one will hurt you again." The words penetrated the fog of exhaustion and cold that surrounded Sarah's mind. "No one will hurt you again." It was a promise, spoken with quiet certainty, and something deep inside her chose to believe it. Larry's cabin appeared through the trees like something from a dream. It was larger than the homestead Sarah had shared with Donald, built of solid logs with a stone chimney from which smoke was already rising. Light glowed warmly in the windows, and Sarah could see that this was a real home, not just a shelter. He carried her inside, and the warmth hit her like a physical blow. The cabin was simply but comfortably furnished, with handmade furniture and shelves lined with books. A fire crackled in a large stone fireplace, and Sarah could smell something wonderful cooking in a pot hung over the flames. Larry set her down gently in a chair beside the fire and began working to remove her wet, frozen clothing. "This might be uncomfortable," he warned, "but we need to get you out of these wet things before you catch pneumonia." His movements were clinical, respectful, focused entirely on her medical needs rather than anything else. As warmth began to return to Sarah's body, pain returned with it. Her fingers and toes burned as circulation returned, and she gasped at the intensity of it. Larry wrapped her in warm, dry blankets and brought her a cup of hot broth. "Drink this slowly," he instructed. "Your body needs to warm up gradually." The broth was the most delicious thing Sarah had ever tasted, rich and nourishing in a way that made her realize how close to starvation she had come. As she sipped it, Larry examined her injured ankle, his touch gentle but thorough. "It is not broken," he concluded, "but it is badly sprained. You will need to stay off it for a while." He prepared a bed for her near the fire, piling it high with furs and blankets. As Sarah settled into it, she felt the baby move for the first time in hours, a strong kick that brought fresh tears to her eyes. Larry noticed her reaction, and his expression softened further. "The baby is all right?" he asked. Sarah nodded, one hand pressed against her belly. "Good," Larry said. "That is very good. Now you need to rest. You are safe here, Sarah. I give you my word." As Sarah drifted toward sleep, she felt safer than she had in months. The warmth of the fire, the softness of the furs, and Larry's quiet presence all combined to create a sense of security she had thought she would never feel again. For the first time since Donald's disappearance, she allowed herself to truly rest. She woke to the smell of cooking food and the sound of Larry moving quietly around the cabin. Daylight streamed through the windows, and Sarah realized she had slept through the night without once waking in terror. The baby was active, moving and kicking in a way that felt healthy and strong. Larry appeared beside her with another cup of broth and a plate of what looked like venison stew. "You need to eat," he said simply. "Both of you do." Sarah accepted the food gratefully, amazed at how much better she felt after one night of real rest and warmth. As she ate, Larry sat nearby, working on what appeared to be a piece of leather tack. He did not press her with questions, did not demand explanations, just let her exist in peace while her body began to heal. The silence between them was comfortable, not awkward, and Sarah found herself studying his profile as he worked. Larry Williams was probably in his 40s, with graying brown hair and a full beard that showed streaks of silver. His hands were large and capable, scarred from years of hard work, but she had seen how gently they could touch. His clothes were practical and well-made, and everything about him suggested competence and reliability. When Sarah finished eating, Larry finally spoke. "I do not want to push you," he said, "but I need to know something about your situation. Are there people looking for you? Family who are worried?" The question brought back all the pain Sarah had been trying to forget. She told him about Donald, about their homestead, about waking up to find her husband gone and their horses stolen. Larry listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as she described her search and her capture by the three men. When she finished, Larry was quiet for a long moment. "Those men," he said finally, "Philip Price, Nathan Richardson, and Stephen Adams. I know of them. They have been causing trouble in these mountains for months. The territorial marshal has been looking for them." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "They said they would come after me if I ran," she whispered. "They said they would find me no matter where I went." Larry's jaw tightened. "They will not find you here," he said with quiet conviction. "And if they do, they will regret it. This I promise you." Over the following days, Sarah's strength gradually returned. Larry proved to be an excellent caretaker, bringing her food and medicine, checking on her ankle, making sure she stayed warm and comfortable. He never pushed her to talk about her ordeal, but he was always ready to listen when she needed to share her fears or memories. As Sarah grew stronger, she began to help with small tasks around the cabin. Larry protested at first, insisting she needed to rest, but she explained that keeping busy helped her feel less helpless. She mended his clothes, helped to prepare meals, and organized his somewhat chaotic collection of books. It was while organizing the books that Sarah learned more about her rescuer. Larry had an impressive library for a mountain man, with volumes on everything from medicine to philosophy to poetry. Many of the books showed signs of frequent reading, and Sarah realized that despite his rough exterior, Larry was an educated and thoughtful man. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Sarah asked him about his background. Larry was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer, but finally he began to speak. "I was not always a mountain man," he said, staring into the flames. "I had a different life once, back in Pennsylvania. I was a doctor, had a practice in a small town, a wife, 2 children. Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. There was an outbreak of cholera, Larry continued, his voice heavy with old pain. I could not stop it, could not save them. My wife, my son, my daughter, they all died within a week of each other. I tried everything I knew, but it was not enough. After that, I could not bear to stay. I sold everything and came west, looking for a place where the past could not follow me. Sarah felt her heart ache for him. I am so sorry, she said softly. Larry nodded, still looking into the fire. It was a long time ago, he said, but it explains why I live alone up here, why I know something about medicine, why I have so many books. Old habits die hard, I suppose. The revelation helped Sarah understand Larry better. Like her, he had lost everything and had to rebuild his life from nothing. Like her, he carried scars that might never fully heal. But unlike her, he had found a way to make peace with his solitude, to create a life that, while lonely, was stable and secure. As winter deepened, Sarah's pregnancy progressed. Larry had enough medical knowledge to monitor her condition, and he assured her that both she and the baby seemed to be doing well, despite everything they had endured. He began preparing for the birth, gathering supplies and making plans for what would need to be done when the time came. Sarah found herself thinking more and more about the future. She could not stay with Larry forever, she knew. It would not be proper, and she had her own life to rebuild. But the thought of leaving this safe haven, of facing the world alone with a newborn baby, filled her with dread. One day in December, as Sarah was preparing lunch, she heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Larry immediately reached for his rifle, his body tense with alertness. Stay away from the windows, he told Sarah, moving to peer through a gap in the curtains. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she crouched behind the kitchen table. One hand pressed protectively over her belly. Had her captors finally found her? Were they about to destroy this sanctuary Larry had provided? But Larry's posture relaxed slightly, and he set down his rifle. It is all right, he said. It is just Marshal Thompson and his deputy. They have been tracking those men you told me about. Larry opened the door to admit two men in official badges, both bundled against the cold. Marshal Thompson was a lean man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. His deputy was younger, with a nervous energy that suggested he was relatively new to law enforcement. Larry, the marshal said, nodding respectfully. We are following a trail that led us this way. 3 men, riding hard, probably within the last few days. You seen anything unusual? Sarah felt Larry's eyes on her, asking permission. She nodded slightly, knowing this moment had to come eventually. Larry gestured for the marshal to come inside, and Sarah stood slowly, her hands clasped protectively over her belly. Marshal Thompson's eyes widened when he saw her condition. Ma'am, he said, touching his hat respectfully, you would not happen to be Sarah Morales, would you? We have been looking for you for months. The marshal explained that Donald's body had been found weeks ago, shot and left in a ravine about 5 miles from their homestead. The territorial government had been searching for Sarah ever since, fearing the worst. When reports came in of 3 men matching the description of her captors, the marshal had intensified his efforts to track them down. They have been running hard since someone spotted them near Silverton, Marshal Thompson said. We think they know we are closing in. Have you seen them, Mrs. Morales? Sarah told the marshal about her escape, about collapsing in the snow, about Larry finding her and bringing her to safety. The marshal listened intently, making notes and asking occasional questions. When she finished, he turned to Larry. You did a good thing, taking her in, the marshal said. Not many men would have taken on that kind of responsibility. Larry just nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. The marshal and his deputy stayed for supper, and over the meal they discussed what would happen next. The 3 men were still at large, but the marshal was confident they would be caught soon. The trail was fresh, and they had nowhere left to run. What about Mrs. Morales, the deputy asked. She cannot stay up here indefinitely, especially with the baby coming. The marshal nodded thoughtfully. We will need to make arrangements, he said. Perhaps she could stay in town until after the birth, then decide what she wants to do long term. Sarah felt a familiar panic rising in her chest. The thought of leaving Larry's cabin, of being among strangers when she was so vulnerable, terrified her. But she also knew the marshal was right. She could not impose on Larry's hospitality forever, especially when her presence might put him in danger. That night after the lawman had left, Sarah and Larry sat by the fire in contemplative silence. Finally, Larry spoke. "You do not have to go if you do not want to," he said quietly. "I know what the marshal said, but this is my home, and you are welcome to stay as long as you need to." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You have already done so much for me," she said. "I cannot ask you to do more." Larry turned to look at her directly, his expression serious. "You are not asking," he said. "I am offering." There is a difference. The conversation was interrupted by a sound outside that made both of them freeze. It was the soft whinny of a horse, muffled as if someone was trying to keep the animal quiet. Larry immediately reached for his rifle, motioning for Sarah to move away from the windows. They sat in tense silence, listening. After several minutes, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the cabin, more than one person moving carefully through the snow. Larry's grip tightened on his rifle, and Sarah felt her heart begin to race. A voice called out from the darkness, rough and familiar. "We know you are in there, Sarah. We know you are hiding our property. Send her out, and maybe we will let the mountain man live." It was Philip Price, the leader of her captors. Somehow they had found her, despite the marshal's pursuit, despite Larry's efforts to keep her safe. Sarah felt all the terror of her captivity come flooding back, and she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. Larry moved to the window, peering out carefully. "How many?" Sarah whispered. Larry held up 3 fingers, confirming her worst fears. All of them had come for her. "You have got 10 seconds, Price called out. "Send her out, or we start shooting." Larry looked at Sarah, his expression grim but determined. "Get down behind the table," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, stay down and stay quiet." The first shot shattered the front window, sending glass flying across the cabin floor. Larry returned fire immediately, the boom of his rifle deafening in the enclosed space. Sarah crouched behind the heavy wooden table, her arms wrapped around her belly, trying to make herself as small as possible. More shots followed, coming from different directions as the 3 men spread out around the cabin. Larry moved from window to window, returning fire whenever he had a clear target. The cabin filled with smoke from gunpowder, and Sarah could smell the acrid scent of burning wood, where a bullet had struck near the fireplace. "This is not working," Larry muttered, reloading his rifle. "They have us pinned down and they can afford to wait." Sarah knew he was right. The 3 men could take turns shooting while the others rested, but Larry was alone and would eventually run out of ammunition. "There is another way out," Larry said suddenly. "There is a root cellar behind the cabin with an entrance that comes up about 50 yards into the trees. If you can make it there, you can get away while I keep them busy." Sarah shook her head violently. "I will not leave you to face them alone," she said. Larry's expression was firm. "You have to think about the baby," he replied. "This is the only way to keep both of you safe." Before Sarah could argue further, the shooting stopped. Price's voice rang out again, closer now. "Last chance, mountain man. Send her out, or we burn you both out." Larry made his decision. He grabbed a heavy coat and thrust it at Sarah. "The cellar entrance is behind the woodpile," he said urgently. "Follow the stream bed north until you reach the old mining road, then head east toward town. Do not stop, do not look back, no matter what you hear." Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to stay and fight beside him, but she knew he was right. The baby's life depended on her getting away, and staying would only ensure that all 3 of them died. With tears streaming down her face, she kissed Larry's cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Larry squeezed her hand briefly, then moved back to the window. "Go," he said. "Now, while they are still talking." Sarah slipped out through the root cellar as quietly as she could, emerging into the cold night air behind a stand of pine trees. She could hear Price still shouting demands from the front of the cabin, which meant the men had not yet realized there was another way out. Moving as quickly as her condition allowed, Sarah made her way toward the stream Larry had mentioned. Behind her, the shooting resumed, and she forced herself not to look back, not to think about what might be happening to the man who had saved her life. The stream bed was icy and treacherous, but it provided cover, and a clear path away from the cabin. Sarah followed it for what felt like hours, stumbling frequently in the darkness, her hands and feet growing numb with cold. The baby was restless, moving constantly as if sensing her distress. Eventually, Sarah reached what had to be the old mining road Larry had described. It was little more than a track through the forest, but it was easier walking than the streambed had been. She turned east as instructed and began the long journey toward town. Dawn was breaking when Sarah finally saw buildings in the distance. Her strength was nearly gone, and she had been stopping to rest every few minutes for the last hour. The baby had grown quiet again, which worried her, but she forced herself to keep moving. The first person she encountered was a woman drawing water from a well behind her house. The woman took one look at Sarah's condition and immediately called for help. Within minutes, Sarah found herself surrounded by concerned townspeople, all asking questions she was too exhausted to answer. Someone sent for the doctor, and Sarah was carried to his office where he examined her thoroughly. Both she and the baby were in surprisingly good condition, considering what she had endured. The doctor insisted she rest for several days before making any decisions about her future. It was while she was recovering that Marshal Thompson arrived with news about the confrontation at Larry's cabin. The marshal's expression was grim as he sat down beside Sarah's bed. "I am sorry, Mrs. Morales," he said quietly. "We were too late to help." When we got there, the cabin was burning, and we found 4 bodies in the yard. Sarah felt her world collapse around her. Larry was dead, killed defending her, and it was her fault for bringing danger to his peaceful mountain home. The marshal continued talking, explaining how they had identified the 3 outlaws and how the case was now closed, but Sarah barely heard him. All she could think about was Larry's kindness, his gentle hands, his promise that no one would hurt her again. The funeral was held 3 days later, and most of the town turned out to pay their respects to the mountain man who had died protecting a pregnant widow. Sarah stood at the graveside, supported by the doctor's wife, and tried to find words for her grief. Larry had saved her life, had given her hope when she had none, and now he was gone because of her. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah remained in town, staying with the doctor and his wife, who had insisted she needed proper care during her final months of pregnancy. The baby was due in early April, and Sarah found herself both eager and terrified to meet the child who had survived so much already. The birth, when it came, was difficult but successful. Sarah's daughter arrived on a warm April morning, healthy and strong despite everything they had endured together. As Sarah held her baby for the first time, she thought about all the people who had not lived to see this moment. Donald, who would never know his daughter. Larry, who had died protecting them both. Sarah named her daughter Hope because that was what Larry had given her when she had nothing left. Hope Williams Gray, carrying the names of all the people who had shaped her story. The baby had Donald's dark hair and Sarah's green eyes, and when she looked at her daughter, Sarah felt a fierce determination to build a life worthy of all the sacrifices that had been made. The doctor and his wife, Karen Moore, and her husband, offered to let Sarah stay with them permanently, helping with their medical practice in exchange for room and board. It was a generous offer that would provide security for both Sarah and Hope, and Sarah accepted gratefully. As spring turned to summer, Sarah began to heal, both physically and emotionally. She learned to assist the doctor with his patients, discovering she had a natural talent for medical work. Perhaps it was something she had absorbed from watching Larry care for her, or perhaps it was simply her own nurturing nature, finding a new outlet. The town slowly accepted Sarah and Hope as permanent residents. There were whispers, of course, about the pregnant widow who had survived captivity and lived alone with a mountain man, but most people were kind and respectful. Sarah held her head high and focused on building a future for her daughter. One day in late summer, as Sarah was tending the doctor's garden with Hope sleeping in a basket beside her, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. She looked up to see a figure approaching through the afternoon haze, and her heart nearly stopped. It was Larry Williams, alive and walking toward her, with a slight limp and a bandage around his left arm. Sarah stood slowly, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "Larry," she whispered, and then louder, "Larry!" She ran to him, and he caught her with his good arm, holding her tight against his chest. "I thought you were dead," Sarah sobbed into his shoulder. "The marshal said there were 4 bodies, that the cabin burned down. Larry's voice was rough with emotion as he replied. There were 4 bodies, he said, but one of them was not mine. I managed to get out through the cellar after you left, but not before taking a bullet in the arm. I have been recovering at a friend's place deeper in the mountains. Larry explained that after Sarah had escaped, he had continued fighting the 3 outlaws until he was wounded and forced to flee through the same route he had shown her. The cabin had indeed burned, and in the confusion, the marshal had miscounted the bodies found in the yard. I came as soon as I was able to travel, Larry said, looking down at Sarah with eyes full of relief. I had to know if you and the baby were safe. Sarah led him to where Hope was sleeping, and Larry's expression softened as he looked down at the tiny girl. She is beautiful, he said quietly, just like her mother. Sarah felt tears starting again, but these were tears of joy rather than grief. You saved us both, she said. I named her Hope Williams Gray after you. Larry's eyes widened in surprise and something that might have been gratitude. That is quite an honor, he said softly. I hope I can live up to it. Over the following weeks, Larry recovered from his injuries while staying at the boarding house in town. He and Sarah spent hours talking, sharing their experiences from the months they had been apart, getting to know each other again in this new context. Sarah learned that Larry had been thinking about leaving the mountains permanently, about finding a way to use his medical knowledge to help people again. The doctor, learning of Larry's background, offered him a partnership in the practice. The town needed more medical help, especially with settlers continuing to arrive, and Larry's experience would be invaluable. After much consideration, Larry accepted the offer. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, Sarah and Larry were married in a simple ceremony at the town church. Hope, now 6 months old and thriving, gurgled happily in Sarah's arms throughout the service. It was not the life Sarah had planned when she first married Donald, but it was a good life, built on mutual respect, shared hardship, and deep affection. Their combined medical practice flourished, with Sarah handling much of the day-to-day patient care, while Larry dealt with more serious injuries and illnesses. They worked well together, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. Hope grew into a bright, active toddler who charmed everyone in town with her sunny disposition. On quiet evenings, as they sat by the fire in their new home, Sarah would sometimes think back to that terrible night when she had collapsed in the snow, certain she was going to die. Larry's words echoed in her memory, the promise that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. No one will hurt you again. He had kept that promise, and in doing so, he had given her something more precious than safety. He had given her the chance to discover her own strength. The seasons turned, and Sarah's life settled into a rhythm of purpose and contentment. She had survived loss, captivity, and despair to build something new and meaningful. Hope grew tall and strong, showing signs of both her parents' intelligence and determination. The medical practice expanded, serving not just the town, but the surrounding mining camps and homesteads. Sometimes travelers would pass through town with stories from the outside world, tales of progress and change sweeping across the territory. Sarah would listen with interest, but she felt no urge to leave the life she had built. This mountain town had become her home in a way that went deeper than geography. It was where she had learned to heal, both herself and others. Larry proved to be not only a skilled doctor, but also a devoted husband and father. He treated Hope as his own daughter, and she adored him in return, following him around the house and trying to help with his medical preparations. Sarah often watched them together and marveled at how love could grow in the most unexpected places. One spring morning, as Sarah was treating a miner's injured hand, a young woman arrived at their clinic in obvious distress. She was bruised and frightened, clutching a bundle that Sarah realized was a baby. The woman's story was heartbreakingly familiar. She had fled an abusive husband, traveling for days with her infant son, and had nowhere else to turn. Sarah looked into the woman's desperate eyes and saw herself as she had been that terrible winter night. Without hesitation, she welcomed the woman into their home, providing food, medical care, and most importantly, safety. Larry supported her decision completely, and together they helped the woman, Lisa Campbell, begin to rebuild her life. This became a pattern over the years. Word spread quietly among the women of the territory that Dr. and Mrs. Williams would help those who had nowhere else to go. Their home became an unofficial sanctuary, a place where broken people could heal and find the strength to start over. Sarah discovered that her own experiences, painful as they had been, gave her unique insight into helping others who had suffered similar traumas. She could speak to their fears with authority, could offer hope based on her own survival. It was as if all the darkness she had endured had been transformed into light she could share with others. The town grew and prospered, and Sarah and Larry became pillars of the community. Sarah served on the school board and helped establish a library, while Larry became the town's first official mayor. They were respected not just for their professional skills, but for their compassion and integrity. Hope grew into a remarkable young woman, inheriting her mother's empathy and her father's intellectual curiosity. She showed early interest in medicine and often assisted in the clinic, displaying a natural talent for healing. Sarah watched her daughter with pride, knowing that Hope would carry forward the values of service and compassion that had defined their family. As Hope reached her teenage years, she began asking questions about her early life, about her biological father, and the circumstances of her birth. Sarah had always been honest about the broad outlines of their story, but now she shared more details, helping Hope understand the full scope of what they had all overcome. Rather than being traumatized by the knowledge, Hope seemed to draw strength from it. She understood that she was the product not just of tragedy, but of incredible resilience and love. The story of her mother's survival and Larry's sacrifice became part of her own identity, a source of pride rather than shame. One evening, as the family sat together reviewing Hope's college applications, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that desperate night in the snow to this warm, secure home filled with love and purpose, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. Larry must have been thinking similar thoughts because he reached over and took Sarah's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The path that brought us together, I mean. It was not exactly conventional." Sarah squeezed his hand and smiled. "Never," she said firmly. "Every hardship, every moment of fear and pain led us to this. Led us to each other, to hope, to the life we have built. I would not change any of it." Hope looked up from her applications and grinned. "Even the part where you thought Dad was dead for 6 months?" she teased. Sarah laughed, remembering those dark days when she had grieved for Larry while he recovered in the mountains. "Especially that part," Sarah said. "It taught me never to take the people I love for granted. Every day we have together is a gift." As winter approached again, Sarah found herself thinking about cycles, about how life moved in patterns of loss and renewal, despair and hope. The mountains that had once seemed so threatening now felt like protective guardians, sheltering their community from the chaos of the outside world. The medical practice continued to thrive, and Sarah had trained several young women as nurses and midwives, ensuring that the community would have skilled medical care for generations to come. She took particular pride in mentoring women who wanted to enter the healing professions, knowing how important it was to have female perspectives in medicine. One snowy December evening, as Sarah was closing up the clinic, she heard a commotion outside. Through the window, she saw a group of men on horseback, supporting someone who appeared to be seriously injured. Sarah quickly called for Larry and began preparing the examination room. The injured man was a stranger, a prospector who had been caught in an avalanche while working his claim in the high country. His leg was badly broken, and he was suffering from exposure and blood loss. As Sarah and Larry worked to stabilize him, the man drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about something he had found in the mountains. It was not until the next morning, when the prospector was more coherent, that his story became clear. He had discovered what appeared to be the remains of an old cabin, burned years ago but with some artifacts still intact. Among the items he had recovered was a small wooden box containing papers and personal effects. Sarah's heart began to race as the prospector described the location. It sounded very much like Larry's old cabin, the one that had burned during the confrontation with her captors. When the man produced the wooden box, Sarah gasped in recognition. It was Larry's medicine kit, the one he had used to treat her injuries when he first found her. Inside the box were papers that had somehow survived the fire, including letters Larry had written but never sent, documenting his thoughts and feelings during the months Sarah had stayed with him. Reading them, Sarah discovered depths of emotion Larry had never expressed directly. His growing love for her, his fear for her safety, his determination to protect her at any cost. One letter dated just days before the final confrontation brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "If something happens to me," Larry had written, "I want Sarah to know that saving her and her child has given my life meaning again. After losing my first family, I thought I would never care about anyone else. But Sarah has shown me that love is not something you lose when tragedy strikes. It is something you choose, again and again, despite the risk of loss." Sarah shared the letters with Larry that evening, and she saw tears in his eyes as he read his own words from so many years ago. "I meant every word," he said quietly. "You and Hope saved me just as much as I saved you." The discovery of the letters seemed to bring their story full circle, a reminder of how far they had all come from those desperate days in the mountains. Sarah decided to preserve the letters as part of their family history, something to pass down to Hope and her future children. As Hope prepared to leave for college the following fall, Sarah felt the bittersweet mixture of pride and loss that all parents experience. Hope had chosen to study medicine, planning to return to their mountain town as a doctor after completing her education. The continuity pleased Sarah, knowing that their work would continue through the next generation. The night before Hope left for college, the family sat together on their front porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountain peaks. Hope was excited about her future, but also sad to leave the only home she had ever known. Sarah understood the feeling, remembering her own journey from the security of her childhood home to the uncertainty of adult life. "You carry all of us with you," Sarah told her daughter. "Everything we have taught you, everything we have learned together, becomes part of who you are wherever you go." Hope nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her mother's words. The years that followed brought changes and challenges, but also continued growth and fulfillment. Hope excelled in her medical studies, writing long letters home about her classes and experiences. Sarah and Larry continued their practice, now training a new generation of medical professionals to serve the expanding territory. Sarah became something of a legend in the region, known not just for her medical skills, but for her work with women and families in crisis. Her own story, while not widely known in all its details, had become part of the local folklore. People spoke of the pregnant widow who had survived the wilderness and found love again, a tale that offered hope to others facing seemingly impossible circumstances. As Sarah entered her 40s, she began to think about writing down her experiences, not for publication, but for her family's records. She wanted Hope's children to understand their heritage, to know the strength and resilience that ran in their bloodline. The process of writing proved therapeutic, helping Sarah process emotions and memories she had carried for decades. Larry encouraged her writing project, often sitting with her in the evenings as she worked on her memoir. Sometimes he would add his own perspective to events, filling in details Sarah had not known at the time. Their collaboration deepened their understanding of their shared history and strengthened their bond even further. One chapter Sarah found particularly difficult to write was about her captivity and abuse. The memories were still painful, even after all these years, and she struggled to find words that conveyed the reality without being overly graphic. Larry helped her through this process, reminding her that her survival was more important than the suffering, that her story was ultimately one of triumph rather than victimization. When Hope returned from medical school as Dr. Hope Williams, the town celebrated with a festival that lasted 3 days. Sarah watched with pride as her daughter took over many of the responsibilities that had once been hers, bringing fresh energy and new knowledge to their practice. The continuity was deeply satisfying, a sign that their work would endure beyond their own lifetimes. Hope had also brought back new ideas about women's health and children's medicine, innovations that improved their ability to serve the community. She established a small hospital, the first in the region, and began training programs for nurses and midwives. Sarah marveled at how her daughter had taken their simple mountain practice and transformed it into something much larger and more sophisticated. As Sarah entered her 50s, she began to slow down slightly, spending more time on administrative work and less on direct patient care. She used this transition to expand her work with women in crisis, establishing a formal network of safe houses and support services throughout the territory. What had begun as informal help for desperate women became an organized system that saved countless lives. The work was deeply meaningful to Sarah because she understood intimately what these women were experiencing. Every frightened face reminded her of her own desperation. Every successful recovery validated her belief that people could overcome even the most devastating circumstances. She had become living proof that survival was possible, that healing could happen, that love could bloom even in the darkest soil. Larry remained her steadfast partner through all of this, supporting her initiatives and providing the medical expertise that made their programs effective. Their marriage had deepened over the years, built on shared purpose as much as personal affection. They had created something together that was larger than either of them individually, a legacy of healing and hope that touched hundreds of lives. One autumn evening, as they sat by their fireplace reviewing the day's work, Sarah reflected on the strange paths that had brought them together. If someone had told her during those dark days of captivity that she would someday be happily married to a mountain man, running a thriving medical practice and helping other women find safety and healing, she would have thought them mad. Yet here she was, living a life she could never have imagined, surrounded by love and purpose. The baby who had sustained her through her darkest hours had grown into a remarkable woman who was now carrying forward their mission of healing. The man who had lifted her from the snow and promised that no one would hurt her again had kept that promise and so much more. Sarah's memoir, when she finally completed it, became a treasured family document. Hope read it with tears in her eyes, finally understanding the full scope of what her parents had endured and overcome. The story would be passed down through the generations, a reminder of the strength that existed within their family line. As Sarah entered her 60s, she began to think more about legacy and the mark she would leave on the world. The medical practice was thriving under Hope's leadership. The network of women's services was well established and growing, and the town had become a model of compassionate community care. She had transformed her own suffering into a force for healing others, turning her worst experiences into her greatest strengths. Larry, now in his 70s, remained active and engaged, though he had officially retired from the more strenuous aspects of medical practice. He spent his time reading, writing, and mentoring young doctors who came to study their methods. His gentle wisdom and deep compassion continued to influence everyone who worked with him. The town had grown substantially over the decades, but it had maintained the character and values that Sarah and Larry had helped establish. New residents were welcomed warmly, and the community's reputation for helping those in need continued to attract people seeking fresh starts and second chances. One spring morning, as Sarah was working in her garden, she received a visit from a young woman who looked vaguely familiar. The woman introduced herself as the daughter of Lisa Campbell, the first woman Sarah had helped after establishing their informal sanctuary. Lisa's daughter had grown up hearing stories about the kind doctor and his wife who had saved her mother's life, and she had come to thank Sarah personally. The visit moved Sarah deeply, reminding her of the ripple effects of compassion. Lisa had gone on to remarry and raise several children, all of whom had grown up with the story of Sarah and Larry's kindness. Some of them had entered helping professions themselves, inspired by the example of service they had learned about from their mother. As Sarah listened to Lisa's daughter talk about her family's life, she realized that this was perhaps the greatest measure of success. Not just the lives they had directly saved, but the values they had passed on, the inspiration they had provided for others to act with compassion and courage. Their influence would continue long after they were gone, carried forward by people they had touched and people those people had touched in turn. That evening, Sarah shared the story of the visit with Larry and Hope. They sat together on their porch, 3 generations united by love and shared purpose, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had been both threatening and protective throughout their lives. Hope announced that she was expecting her first child, news that filled Sarah with joy and anticipation. The cycle would continue. Another generation would carry forward their values and their story. Sarah thought about the grandchild she would soon hold. A child who would grow up hearing about the pregnant widow who was too bruised to stand, and the mountain man who lifted her and promised that no one would hurt her again. The promise had been kept, not just for Sarah, but for countless others who had found safety and healing through their work. As Sarah looked at her family and thought about the community they had built, she felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal happiness. They had taken their pain and transformed it into purpose, their trauma into triumph. The mountains stood silent and eternal around them, witnesses to all the human drama that had played out in their shadows. Sarah no longer saw them as threatening barriers, but as protective guardians, sheltering a community built on compassion and resilience. The wilderness that had once nearly killed her had become the foundation of her greatest achievements. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Sarah felt the presence of all the people who had shaped her journey. Donald, whose love had given her the strength to survive. The three outlaws whose cruelty had taught her the value of kindness. Larry, whose promise had sustained her and whose love had transformed her. Hope, whose very existence was proof that beauty could emerge from ashes. The story that had begun with such darkness had become a beacon of light for others. Sarah's survival had meaning beyond her own life. Her healing had enabled the healing of others. Her love had multiplied and spread throughout the community. The pregnant widow who had been too bruised to stand had become a pillar of strength for everyone around her. As Sarah entered the final phase of her life, she continued to find new ways to serve her community and share the wisdom she had gained through her experiences. Her memoir had been quietly circulated among the women's networks she had established, and many found strength and inspiration in her story. She began speaking at gatherings of women throughout the territory, sharing her message of resilience and hope. These speaking engagements were not easy for Sarah, as they required her to revisit painful memories and share intimate details of her suffering. But she found that each telling of her story seemed to help someone in the audience, someone who was facing their own dark night of the soul and needed to hear that survival was possible. Larry often accompanied her to these events, providing quiet support and sometimes sharing his own perspective on their journey. Their partnership had become legendary throughout the region, a model of how love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances and flourish into something that blessed an entire community. Hope's children, when they arrived, brought new joy and energy to Sarah's later years. She delighted in being a grandmother, sharing stories and wisdom with the next generation, while also learning from their fresh perspectives. The children grew up hearing about their family's remarkable history, understanding from an early age that they came from a line of survivors and healers. As Sarah watched her grandchildren play in the same mountains where she had once nearly died, she marveled at the complete transformation of her relationship with this landscape. What had once represented danger and despair now symbolized home and security. The wilderness had not changed, but her understanding of it had been completely transformed. The medical practice continued to evolve under Hope's leadership, in incorporating new techniques and technologies while maintaining the compassionate approach that had always defined their work. Students came from across the country to study their methods, particularly their integrated approach to treating both physical and emotional trauma. Sarah's network of women's services had grown into a formal organization with chapters throughout the Western Territories. What had begun as informal help for desperate women had become a structured system of support that included safe houses, job training, legal assistance, and emotional counseling. The organization bore Sarah's name, though she had initially resisted the honor. One of Sarah's greatest satisfactions in her later years was seeing former clients become advocates and helpers themselves. Women who had once arrived at their door broken and desperate were now running their own chapters of the organization, helping other women find safety and rebuild their lives. The cycle of healing had become self-sustaining, growing beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. Larry's health began to decline in his 80s, though his mind remained sharp and his compassion undiminished. Sarah cared for him with the same tenderness he had once shown her, their roles reversed but their love unchanged. They spent long hours together, reading, talking, and simply enjoying each other's presence. During Larry's final illness, Sarah reflected on their decades together and felt nothing but gratitude. He had given her far more than safety and protection. He had shown her how to transform suffering into service, how to build meaning from tragedy, how to create a legacy that would outlast their physical lives. When Larry passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his family, Sarah felt grief but also deep appreciation for the life they had shared. His funeral drew people from across the territory, a testament to the lives he had touched and the difference he had made. Sarah spoke at the service, sharing the story of how he had lifted her from the snow and promised that no one would hurt her again. He kept that promise, Sarah told the gathered crowd, not just for me, but for everyone who came to us seeking help. Larry Williams was a man who understood that true strength lies not in power over others, but in the willingness to lift up those who have fallen. After Larry's death, Sarah continued their work with renewed dedication, seeing it as a way to honor his memory and continue their shared mission. Hope provided invaluable support during this difficult time, helping her mother navigate grief while maintaining their community commitments. Sarah's grandchildren, now teenagers, began to take more active roles in the family's work. They volunteered at the clinic, helped with the women's organization, and showed early signs of inheriting the family's commitment to service. Sarah watched them with pride, knowing that the values she and Larry had tried to instill were taking root in the next generation. As Sarah entered her 70s, she began to think more seriously about succession planning and ensuring that their work would continue after she was gone. The organization was well established with capable leadership, but Sarah wanted to make sure that the personal touch and deep understanding that had always characterized their approach would not be lost. She began an intensive mentoring program, working closely with younger women who had shown both the skills and the heart necessary to carry forward their mission. These women spent months shadowing Sarah, learning not just the practical aspects of helping trauma survivors, but the deeper wisdom that came from having walked that path herself. One of these mentees was a young woman named Brenda Miller, who had arrived at their door 5 years earlier as a victim of domestic violence and had since become one of their most effective counselors. Brenda had an intuitive understanding of trauma and a natural gift for helping other women find their strength. Sarah saw in her a worthy successor to continue their work. The process of training these successors forced Sarah to articulate wisdom she had previously shared only through example and intuition. She found herself explaining not just what to do, but why, helping her mentees understand the deeper principles that had guided her work for decades. Trust must be earned slowly, Sarah would tell them. Never push someone to share more than they are ready to reveal. Sometimes the most healing thing you can do is simply believe their story without question. Remember that survival takes many forms, and what looks like weakness may actually be incredible strength. These teaching sessions became some of the most meaningful work of Sarah's later years. She was not just helping individual women anymore, but training a new generation of helpers who would multiply her impact far beyond what she could accomplish alone. As Sarah's 80th birthday approached, the community began planning a celebration that would honor her decades of service. Sarah initially resisted, preferring to keep the focus on their work rather than herself. But hope convinced her that the celebration would provide an opportunity to raise funds and awareness for their cause. The event, when it finally took place, exceeded everyone's expectations. People came from across the region to honor Sarah, including dozens of women whose lives had been transformed by her help. Former clients spoke about what Sarah's intervention had meant to them. Their children shared how growing up in a safe environment had shaped their own lives, and community leaders praised the model of compassionate care that Sarah had established. But perhaps the most moving moment came when Brenda Miller presented Sarah with a quilt made by the women they had helped over the years. Each square had been created by a different woman, telling part of her story through fabric and thread. The quilt was a visual representation of the community of survivors Sarah had helped create, each individual story contributing to a larger narrative of healing and hope. As Sarah looked at the quilt, she could see her own journey reflected in its patterns. Squares depicting darkness and despair were balanced by others showing light and renewal. The overall design was beautiful, a work of art created from fragments of pain and transformation. It was perhaps the perfect metaphor for what her life had become. In her speech that evening, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 62 years ago, she said, I was a pregnant widow lying in the snow, certain I was going to die. I could never have imagined that my survival would lead to this, to a life filled with purpose and surrounded by love. She spoke about Larry and his promise, about hope and her continuation of their work, about the community of survivors who had become her extended family. But mostly, she spoke about the power of human resilience and the importance of helping others discover their own strength. We all have moments when we are too bruised to stand, Sarah concluded. But if we are fortunate, someone comes along to lift us up and remind us that we are stronger than we know. Our job then becomes to be that person for others, to lift them up and help them find their own way forward. The celebration marked a transition point in Sarah's life. While she continued to be involved in their work, she gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations, confident that the organization was in capable hands. She spent more time with her grandchildren, sharing stories and wisdom, enjoying the simple pleasures of family life. One of her greatest joys was watching her grandchildren develop their own sense of purpose and service. The oldest, a boy named after Larry, showed interest in medicine and talked about becoming a doctor like his mother. The youngest, a girl with Sarah's green eyes and determined spirit, already showed signs of inheriting the family's gift for helping others heal. As Sarah entered her final years, she found herself thinking often about legacy and meaning. She had lived far longer than she had ever expected during those dark days in the mountains, and she had accomplished more than she could have dreamed. But what mattered most to her was not the recognition or the institutional success, but the individual lives that had been touched and transformed. She kept a journal in these later years, recording not just events, but reflections on the deeper meanings of her experiences. These writings became another gift to her family, a record of hard-won wisdom that could guide future generations. In one entry, she wrote about the nature of survival and strength. I used to think that strength meant never falling down, never showing weakness, never needing help. But I have learned that true strength lies in the ability to get back up, to accept help when it is offered, to transform pain into purpose. The strongest people I have known are not those who have never suffered, but those who have suffered and chosen to use that experience to help others. Another entry reflected on the power of promises and the importance of keeping one's word. Larry promised that no one would hurt me again, and he kept that promise not just through his own actions, but by teaching me to protect myself and others. The most powerful promises are not just about what we will do, but about what we will help others become. Sarah's health remained remarkably good well into her 80s, a fact she attributed to having found her purpose in life and being surrounded by love and meaningful work. She continued to garden, to read voraciously, and to correspond with women throughout their network who sought her advice and wisdom. One of her regular correspondents was a young woman in California who was starting a similar organization for women fleeing domestic violence. Sarah provided guidance and encouragement, helping her avoid some of the pitfalls and challenges that had complicated their early efforts. This mentoring relationship, conducted entirely through letters, became one of Sarah's most rewarding activities. The exchange of letters also provided Sarah with insights into how their model was being adapted and improved in different contexts. She learned about new approaches to trauma treatment, innovative funding strategies, and creative ways to build community support. Even in her 80s, Sarah continued to learn and grow, incorporating new ideas into her understanding of their work. Hope's children, now young adults, began to take on more responsibility in the family enterprises. The medical practice had expanded to include multiple doctors and nurses, serving not just their original town, but several surrounding communities. The women's organization had chapters in 6 states and was beginning to influence national policy discussions about domestic violence and women's rights. Sarah watched these developments with satisfaction, but also with some amazement. The work that had begun with her own desperate need for safety had grown into something that touched thousands of lives and influenced social policy across the region. It was a powerful reminder of how individual actions, motivated by compassion and sustained by determination, could have far-reaching consequences. As Sarah approached her 90th birthday, she began to experience some of the physical limitations that come with advanced age. Her eyesight dimmed, her hearing became less acute, and her mobility decreased. But her mind remained sharp, and her commitment to their work never wavered. The family adapted their home to accommodate Sarah's changing needs, and Hope arranged her schedule to spend more time with her mother. These quiet hours together became precious to both women, opportunities to share memories, discuss the future, and simply enjoy each other's company. During one of these conversations, Hope asked her mother if she had any regrets about the path her life had taken. Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. I regret the suffering that brought us together, she said. I regret that Donald died, that those three men caused so much pain, that Larry had to sacrifice his peaceful mountain life to save me. But I do not regret the life that grew from those ashes. I do not regret the work we have done or the people we have helped. Sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the darkest soil. Sarah's 90th birthday celebration was a quieter affair than her 80th had been, but it was no less meaningful. Family and close friends gathered to honor her life and legacy, sharing stories and memories that painted a picture of a woman who had transformed personal tragedy into a force for healing in the world. The highlight of the celebration was the presentation of a scholarship fund established in Sarah's name. The fund would provide educational opportunities for women who had survived domestic violence or other trauma, helping them build new lives and careers. It was a fitting tribute to someone who had always believed in the power of education and opportunity to transform lives. In her brief remarks at the celebration, Sarah spoke about the importance of hope and the power of human connection. We are all connected, she said, her voice still strong despite her age. The pain of one becomes the pain of all, but so does the healing. When we lift up one person, we lift up everyone. When we choose compassion over cruelty, we make the whole world a little bit brighter. As winter approached, Sarah began to speak more often about feeling tired and ready to rest. She had lived a full life, accomplished meaningful work, and seen her values carried forward by the next generation. She spoke without fear about death, viewing it as simply the next stage of her journey. Hope struggled with the prospect of losing her mother, the woman who had been not just a parent, but a mentor, partner, and best friend. Sarah comforted her daughter with characteristic wisdom. I will not really be gone, she said. I will live on in the work we have done, in the lives we have touched, in the values you will pass on to your children. Death is not the end of influence. It is just the end of presence. On a quiet December evening, as snow fell softly outside her bedroom window, Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was surrounded by family, including Hope and her grandchildren, who had been taking turns staying with her during her final weeks. Sarah's funeral drew people from across the country, a testament to the lives she had touched and the difference she had made. Women who had been helped by her organization decades earlier came to pay their respects, many bringing their own children and grandchildren to honor the woman who had made their lives possible. The eulogies painted a picture of a woman who had refused to let trauma define her, who had chosen to transform suffering into service, who had built a legacy of healing that would continue long after her death. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from Brenda Miller, who had become the national director of Sarah's organization. Sarah Williams taught us that survival is not enough, Brenda said. She showed us that we must take our survival and use it to help others find their own strength. She proved that the most broken among us can become the most powerful healers, that the deepest wounds can become the source of the greatest wisdom. Sarah was buried beside Larry in the town cemetery, their graves overlooking the mountains where their love story had begun. The headstone bore a simple inscription, Sarah Williams, 1855-1945. She lifted others as she had been lifted. In the months following Sarah's death, the full scope of her influence became even more apparent. Letters poured in from around the world, from women whose lives had been touched by her work, from organizations that had been inspired by her model, from communities that had benefited from her approach to healing trauma. Hope worked with the board of Sarah's organization to establish a permanent memorial, a training center where people from around the world could come to learn the methods and principles that Sarah had developed over decades of work. The center would ensure that Sarah's wisdom and approach would continue to influence new generations of helpers and healers. The training center opened 2 years after Sarah's death, housed in a beautiful building constructed with funds donated by grateful families and communities. The center's library contained Sarah's memoir, her journals, and extensive records of their work, creating a resource for researchers and practitioners interested in trauma recovery and community healing. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Sarah's life was the continued growth and success of the organization she had founded. By the 10th anniversary of her death, the network had expanded to include chapters in 12 states and had helped thousands of women and families escape violence and rebuild their lives. Each woman who found safety through the organization, each child who grew up free from violence because their mother had been helped to escape, each family that was healed rather than destroyed by trauma represented a living memorial to Sarah's vision and dedication. The story of the pregnant widow who was too bruised to stand, and the mountain man who lifted her and promised that no one would hurt her again had become more than just a personal narrative. It had become a parable about the power of human compassion, the importance of keeping promises, and the possibility of transforming even the darkest experiences into sources of light for others. Hope continued the medical practice and remained active in the organization until her own retirement, always carrying forward the values and approaches she had learned from her parents. She often spoke about the responsibility of carrying on their legacy, but also about the joy of seeing their work continue to evolve and grow. Sarah's grandchildren, now adults with families of their own, carried forward the family tradition of service in various ways. Some became doctors or nurses, others became social workers or counselors, and still others found different ways to contribute to their communities. But all of them carried within them the story of their grandmother's survival and transformation, a story that reminded them of their own capacity for resilience and service. As the decades passed, the story of Sarah and Larry became part of the folklore of the region, told and retold by people who had never met them, but who understood the power of their example. Schools taught their story as part of local history, churches used it as an example of faith and perseverance, and families passed it down as a reminder of what was possible even in the darkest circumstances. The mountains that had witnessed Sarah's near death and rebirth stood unchanged, their peaks still snow-covered, their forests still wild and beautiful. But the communities nestled in their valleys bore the permanent mark of two people who had chosen to transform their personal tragedy into a force for healing others. New challenges arose over the years, different forms of trauma and violence that required new approaches and solutions. But the fundamental principles that Sarah and Larry had established, the belief in human resilience and the power of compassion to heal, remained constant and relevant. The organization Sarah had founded continued to evolve, incorporating new understanding about trauma and recovery while maintaining the personal touch and deep empathy that had always characterized their work. Each new generation of leaders brought fresh energy and ideas while staying true to the core values that had guided the organization from its beginning. Researchers who studied their methods found that the integration of practical help with emotional support, the emphasis on empowering survivors rather than simply rescuing them, and the creation of supportive communities rather than isolated services had been far ahead of their time. Sarah's intuitive understanding of trauma and recovery, born from her own experience, had anticipated many discoveries that formal psychology would not make for decades. The training center established in Sarah's memory became a destination for people from around the world who wanted to learn about community-based approaches to healing trauma. Students came from countries where war and violence had shattered communities, from urban areas where poverty and crime created ongoing trauma, from rural areas where isolation made it difficult for survivors to find help. Each group of students who passed through the center carried Sarah's influence back to their own communities, adapting her methods to different cultures and circumstances, but always maintaining the core principle that had guided her work. The belief that every person has the capacity for healing and growth, and that with proper support, even the most damaged individuals can become sources of strength for others. The memoir Sarah had written for her family was eventually published, though not until many years after her death, when Hope felt that enough time had passed to share her mother's story more widely. The book became a bestseller, not because of its literary merits, but because of the power of Sarah's story to inspire and encourage others facing their own dark nights of the soul. Readers wrote to Hope describing how Sarah's story had given them courage to leave abusive relationships, to seek help for trauma, to believe that their own survival was possible. The book became a resource for counselors and therapists working with trauma survivors, and its insights into the process of healing and recovery influenced professional practice in the field. But perhaps the most important legacy of Sarah's story was not in the institutions she had founded or the policies she had influenced, but in the countless individual moments of compassion and courage that her example had inspired. Every time someone chose to help rather than ignore, To lift up rather than tear down, to offer hope rather than despair, they were in some small way continuing the work that Sarah had begun. The promise that Larry had made in that snowy forest, that no one would hurt Sarah again, had been kept not just through his own actions, but through the actions of thousands of people who had been touched by their story and inspired to make similar promises to others in need. As the centennial of Sarah's birth approached, the organization she had founded organized a series of events to commemorate her life and legacy. Communities across the country held gatherings to honor local heroes who had followed Sarah's example, creating their own networks of support and healing. The main celebration was held in the town where Sarah had lived and worked, now grown into a small city but still maintaining the character and values she had helped establish. The event drew people from around the world, including descendants of women Sarah had personally helped, researchers who had studied her methods, and activists who had been inspired by her example. The keynote speaker was a woman who had been one of the last people Sarah had personally counseled, a young mother who had arrived at their door in the 1940s with two small children and no resources. That woman had gone on to become a teacher, had raised successful children, and had spent her own later years volunteering with organizations that helped other women in crisis. Standing before the assembled crowd, she shared what Sarah had meant to her and to countless others. Sarah Williams showed us that survival is not just about staying alive, she said. It is about choosing to live fully, to love deeply, to serve others, even after experiencing the worst that life can offer. She proved that our scars can become our sources of strength, that our wounds can become our wisdom. The celebration concluded with the unveiling of a statue in the town square, depicting a woman lifting a child, symbolizing the countless times Sarah had lifted up those who had fallen. The inscription read simply, "In memory of Sarah Williams and all who choose to lift others as they have been lifted." As the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed Sarah's transformation from victim to healer, the crowd dispersed, but the influence of her story continued to ripple outward. Children who had heard the speeches would grow up knowing that heroism was not about grand gestures, but about daily choices to help and heal. Adults who had been inspired by her example would return to their own communities with renewed commitment to service and compassion. The story of the pregnant widow who was too bruised to stand, and the mountain man who lifted her and promised that no one would hurt her again, had become more than just a historical account. It had become a living testament to the power of human resilience, the importance of keeping promises, and the possibility of transforming even the darkest experiences into sources of light for others. In the end, Sarah's greatest achievement was not the organization she had founded or the policies she had influenced, but the simple fact that she had proven it was possible to take a life shattered by trauma and rebuild it into something beautiful and meaningful. Her story offered hope to anyone facing their own dark night, proof that survival was possible, that healing could happen, that love could bloom even in the harshest soil. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, but the communities in their shadow had been forever transformed by two people who had chosen to turn their personal tragedy into a force for healing others. Their promise that no one would hurt Sarah again had been kept not just for her, but for thousands of others who had found safety and hope through their work. And so the story continued, not as a tale of the past, but as a living example of what was possible when people chose compassion over cruelty, hope over despair, healing over hatred. Every person who heard Sarah's story and was inspired to help another, every organization that adopted her methods, every community that embraced her values, carried forward the promise that had begun in a snowy forest so many years ago. The pregnant widow had indeed been too bruised to stand, but she had been lifted up, and in turn had spent her life lifting others. The mountain man had kept his promise, and in doing so had created a legacy that would continue to lift and heal for generations to come. Their story had become proof that even in the darkest moments, hope was possible, healing was achievable, and love could triumph over the worst that life could offer.